In my 23 years of playing fantasy football, I have never seen so many backup quarterbacks starting and actually playing well. Listen to this just from last week. Desmond Ridder, Jake Browning, Bailey Zappi, Mitchell Trubisky, Joe Flacco, Zach Wilson, Tommy DeVito, Drew Lock, and Will Levis, they all outscored the likes of Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, Jared Goff, Tua Tagovailoa, CJ Stroud, and Justin Herbert. But now it's time for the fantasy playoffs. And heading into the fantasy playoffs, we could have 11 quarterbacks starting that were not week 1 starters in the NFL. Buckle up. We're going discount shopping here for some quarterbacks in week 15. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there today. We're talking about the quarterbacks we should start and sit here on week 15 fantasy football. The fantasy playoffs have started for so many people, but with so many quarterbacks who really, a lot of people, myself included, do not want to start in fantasy football actually producing, we need to take a look at some of the bigger things that really matter here in the next few weeks. Things like healthy quarterbacks. I gotta have a healthy quarterback. How about guys playing in good matchups with healthy wide receivers to throw the ball to on teams that have the most to play for? And if all of that wasn't enough, a little bit of consistency over the last few weeks would really help. But what quarterbacks kind of fit that narrative? That's what we're looking for here today. Now, before we do, got a quick question. Does anyone out there like eggnog? I know there's a few of you out there that like to partake in the spiked eggnog. You think you're fooling a lot of people, but honestly, you're really not. Now, if you find yourselves 3 eggnogs deep and just starting to feel it, don't pay for it the next day. Remember, we have found probably one of the best products we have ever had on this show in Waterboy. Remember, Waterboy has 0 sugar, 0 caffeine, only 10 calories, and 3 times the electrolytes as their main competitor. It's gonna be something that can rehydrate you so you're not all hungover the next day going to work. It's bad enough that you have to work on the holidays. Don't go into work not feeling the best. Plus, it also has a lot of vitamins in it that's gonna give you a boost of energy, which so many people need nowadays. All it takes is 1 packet of Waterboy and up to 32 ounces of water, and you're on your way to recovery. But I know you got a lot of Christmas presents to buy this season, so don't pay full price for it. Head over to waterboy.com/headliners and get yourself 15% off your order. There are links down below in the description. But we got a lot of football to talk about. No more teams on bye. Plus, this is the week that we start Saturday football. So we got football on Thursday, on Saturday, on Sunday, and on Monday. But just like we always do, let's kick it off on Thursday Night Football with a matchup between the Los Angeles Chargers and Las Vegas Raiders. And with the news that came out early on Tuesday, we know it's not going to be Justin Herbert for the Los Angeles Chargers. He's done for the year. He had finger surgery, which means we're going to the young kid Easton Stick, who's going to make his first ever NFL start. And what could be better? A football player named after baseball equipment. That just screams athlete. And we saw some of that on display just last week when he came into the game for an injured Justin Herbert. 179 yards passing, no touchdowns, no interceptions, but he's not some dink and dunk type quarterback. He's going to throw the ball deep down the field in this offense. We even saw it on display last week with a huge 56-yard bomb down the field to Quentin Johnston. But this isn't the best of matchups. Las Vegas, pretty solid against opposing quarterbacks, allowing only 15.2 fantasy points per game. That is 9th fewest in the NFL. We also know a lot of weapons banged up in LA. Keenan Allen, Gerald Everett, Donald Parham, they're all questionable to play in this ball game, but there is hope. It's not confirmed at the time of this show, but honestly, Josh Palmer is getting super close to a return. He was estimated as a full participant in practice on Monday, which means it could happen here this week. So we have a healthy quarterback in Easton Stick, but all of his weapons as of right now are basically limited. He's going against a top 10 defense against opposing quarterbacks on the road in his first ever NFL start on a short week in primetime football. I don't know about you, but that just screams a lot of risk for me. How about on the other side of the football in Aiden O'Connell? As for Aiden O'Connell, we've seen him through 6 starts so far this season, and in all 6 of those games, he's failed to score over 13.9 fantasy points in any one of them. He isn't playing horrible, he just isn't doing much. He has no rushing upside and only 4 passing touchdowns on the season. Really puts things into perspective for quarterbacks in similar situations. Where Aiden O'Connell has struggled, we see the likes of Jake Browning, who comes in, gets his opportunity, and excels. But this matchup is absolutely great for Aidan O'Connell. The Chargers allow 19 fantasy points per game. That is 6th most in the NFL, and he actually started a game against this team earlier in the season, way back in week 4. In that game, 238 yards, no touchdowns, 1 interception, but that was his first ever NFL start. We also know that Josh Jacobs suffered a quad injury last week, and he's questionable to play. If he can't go this week, do we see Aidan O'Connell airing it out more down the field against a defense who's vulnerable through the air? Because if that's the case, as ugly as it sounds, he could be a decent quarterback 2 for us this week. I mean, he's healthy, he's got healthy weapons to throw the ball to, he's in a good matchup. Now, does that mean that we want to throw him up inside our top 12? No, absolutely not, because there has been zero consistency and zero solid production from Aidan O'Connell through 6 games this season. But when the rankings come out, he may be a little bit higher this week than he has been in weeks past. But now is the time where we typically go over to some Sunday football. Not the case this week. We got Saturday football here for the next couple of weeks. First game up, Minnesota Vikings, Cincinnati Bengals. And for Minnesota, last week we saw them bench Josh Dobbs and bring in Nick Mullins. Coming into last week, though, Josh Dobbs had to be named the starter. It wasn't even his job solely. You have to think that after the benching, they go towards Nick Mullins here this week. Now, maybe you recognize the name of Nick Mullins, and if you do, it's probably due to his playing days in San Francisco, but he hasn't done anything in the league, really, since 2020. That year, he averaged 243 yards passing per game, but had 12 touchdowns to 12 interceptions in 8 starts. He's then bounced around the league, but now he finds himself with an opportunity in Minnesota, but these are must-win games for the Vikings still. In a matchup going up against Cincinnati, they allow 18.5 fantasy points per game. That is 9th most in the league. But this team right here is dealing with injuries. Justin Jefferson came back last week and within just moments was back out again. He suffered a chest injury and actually had to go to the hospital after the game last week. Now, word has already come out that there's a chance that he could play here this week, but we're waiting to find out. We also know that Alexander Mattison is questionable, along with 2 members of the offensive line. Now, sure, we know Nick Mullins himself is healthy, and this is an overall decent matchup for the quarterback of the Minnesota Vikings, but in order to even remotely consider him as a quarterback 2 in fantasy football this week, we need a healthy Justin Jefferson. I kind of compare him to what we said with Aidan O'Connell. He's not a must-start guy, but he's going to be a little bit higher in the rankings than maybe we normally would have ranked him due to this decent matchup as long as Justin Jefferson is healthy. But what about on the other side of the football? Jake Browning continues to go out there and ball. I can't say enough good things about Jake Browning. Over his 3 full games that he started, he's averaging 21 fantasy points per game. Over the last 3 weeks, he's the overall quarterback 6 in fantasy football and has the exact same amount of points as Brock Purdy. And while he's no Lamar Jackson on the ground, he can still get it done with his feet if needed. He's had rushing touchdowns now in back-to-back ball games, and because of that, he's averaging 2 total touchdowns per game over his last 3 games, which is absolute fantasy gold. Now he gets a matchup going up against Minnesota, though, and honestly, they're a pretty tough defense. However, they are easier to throw on than they are to run on. They're allowing 15.7 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but this offense overall in Cincinnati is healthy. Jake Browning himself is healthy. The matchup is decent, and he's shown some consistent good play here as of late. He's actually finished as a top 5 fantasy quarterback now in back-to-back ball games. Now, he may not be up inside my top 12, but he's going to be pretty dang close. On to the next game here on Saturday, a matchup between the Indianapolis Colts and Pittsburgh Steelers. Will kick it off in Pittsburgh with Mitchie Biscuits, and him finishing as the overall quarterback 8 in week 14 has to be one of the biggest shocks of the week. It was entirely thanks to his 30 yards rushing, a rushing touchdown, and a 2-point conversion, though. I'll buy the rushing yards each and every week. We know he's somewhat mobile, but I'm not buying a weekly rushing touchdown or a weekly 2-point conversion. Those are 8 points right there in week 14 that we really can't rely upon weekly. If we were to take away those 8 points, he would have been the quarterback 21 overall. Through the air, he went 22 of 35 for 190 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. And really, that's kind of where I see him hanging around weekly. Now a matchup going up against Indianapolis. They allow 15.9 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That's right around league average. This offense is fairly healthy, but the defense is really struggling with some injuries. Both TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith currently in the concussion protocol and questionable to play here in week 15. So we have a healthy quarterback. We have healthy offensive weapons in a decent matchup in must-win games, plus a slight rushing upside for Mitchell Trubisky. The problem is the ceiling is going to be limited each and every week with Pittsburgh's overall offense, which is mind-blowing to say because honestly, they have enough weapons on offense where they should be going up there and putting up solid numbers each and every week, but for whatever reason, they can't seem to figure out the passing game in Pittsburgh, and for that reason, Mitchie Biscuit's going to be hovering right around the top 20. On the other side of the football, we got Gardner Minshew, and I don't know about you, but do you ever watch Gardner Minshew play, and does it look like he's racking up fantasy points? But then at the end of the game, you look at his total, and he's always hovering right around 15 points a game or so. Not bad, but not great either. Over his last 3 games, he's averaging 40 pass attempts a game, which is great. He's completing right around 65% of his passes, which is solid. He just can't get them TDs consistently. Now he gets a matchup going up against Pittsburgh. They allow 15.1 fantasy points per game. That's 8th fewest in the NFL. We also know that offensive tackle Braden Smith, questionable to play in this ballgame, would love to have him out there for Gardner Minshew here in week 15. So we have a healthy quarterback in Minshew. His weapons, his offensive pass-catching weapons are healthy. The matchup isn't great, but these are still must-win games for Indianapolis. Gardner Minshew for me this week, going to be a Verge top 15 play. Which then takes us to our last matchup on Saturday, the Denver Broncos and Detroit Lions. And it's the only game of our first 4 games where both quarterbacks were week 1 starters. But we'll kick it off with Russ because he continues to be a solid weekly fantasy option. He's had at least 16 fantasy points in 5 of his last 6 games played and now has 3 straight games with at least 2 total touchdowns. The rushing upside is fairly consistent as well. He's had at least 30 yards rushing in 4 of his last 6 games. Now matchup going up against Detroit. They allow 19.3 fantasy points per game. That is 4th most in the NFL to opposing quarterbacks. This overall offense is healthy. Russ is healthy. The matchup is great, and they're playing inside so we don't have to worry about bad weather. Plus, we also have solid, consistent production now for multiple weeks. And what's really crazy to think about, the Denver Broncos only trail the Kansas City Chiefs by 1 game in the division, so they have to keep winning. Russell Wilson, for me this week, is going to be a top 12 option. How about on the other side of the football for Jared Goff? Coming off one of his worst games of the season, 161 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions, against the Chicago Bears just last week. That was his first game without 2 touchdowns since Halloween. It was a bad game. It happens. But man, the Lions do not look anywhere near as good as they did to start the season. But this is going to be a home game. Time for them to right the ship there in Detroit. In a matchup going up against Denver, they allow 17.2 fantasy points per game, but that number continues to fall weekly. This defense is still pretty run down in Detroit, but overall the offense is fairly healthy. Jared Goff, he's healthy. The matchup, though, really looks better on paper than it really is. Like I said, that number continues to drop weekly with what Denver allows to opposing quarterbacks. They were so bad to start the season, they're still trying to work that average down to a more respectable number. But with the Lions back at home and the consistency that we've pretty much seen most of the season from Jared Goff, I look at the Lions to get back on track this week and make Jared Goff a Verge top 12 play in week 15. But finally, we can head over to some Sunday football. The Atlanta Falcons, the Carolina Panthers, and for Desmond Ridder and what we saw from him last week, which was a huge game, that's more of a testament to how bad the Tampa Bay defense is than to how good Desmond Ridder is. Still had a solid game, not taking anything away from him. But that's why we liked Drake London so much last week. It was due to the matchup. Week 14 was the very first game that Desmond Ridder has had with 300 yards passing and multiple touchdowns since week 5. He's a decent option at home in good matchups. But this is not one of those games. He's going to be on the road in Carolina, and they allow only 13 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is fewest in the NFL. Plus, 2 members of their offensive line in Atlanta are questionable to play here in this ballgame. Now, sure, Desmond Ridder is healthy, and so are his 2 pass-catchy weapons that he has in this offense, but he struggles on the road, and this is a super difficult matchup. He'll be a Verge top 20 option this week. Now, as for Bryce Young, it just continues to get worse and worse by the week. This is now 6 straight games with under 200 yards passing, only has 1 touchdown over his last 5 games played, and only completed 36.1% of his passes in week 14, a season low, and it looked bad. He only has 3 games all year long in which he was sacked less than 4 times. That right there is preposterous. Now they get a matchup going up against Atlanta. They allow 17.9 fantasy points per game. That's 11th most in the NFL. Now, overall, this offense is fairly healthy, but for the most part this season, they've been healthy all year long, and it just does not matter. There can't be anyone out there contemplating starting Bryce Young in fantasy football. He's been one of the worst fantasy quarterbacks all year long. Which will then take us out to Cleveland for the Browns and the Bears, and we're about to see what Justin Fields can do in arguably his most difficult matchup of the season. He's now scored at least 21 fantasy points in 2 of his 3 games since returning from injury, but he's also had at least 50 yards rushing in all 3 of those games as well. The TDs, they've been a little bit slow to come by, but this rushing absolutely helps. The biggest issue here is the matchup. Going up against Cleveland, they allow only 14 fantasy points per game. That's 4th fewest in the NFL. Overall, though, this offense is fairly healthy. Justin Fields himself, he's healthy. But we all know the matchup going up against Cleveland isn't going to be easy. However, right now, defensive back Denzel Ward is questionable to play. That could be a bonus for Justin Fields. We're going to need the rushing upside to carry us here. I have him more as a low-end quarterback 1 on the week. How about on the other side of the football, Joe Flacco? And I'm really starting to think that the Browns should have just signed Joe Flacco instead of paying all that money to Deshaun Watson, because as of right now, Joe Flacco is playing just as good, if not better, than Watson ever has in this offense. In the 2 starts that we've seen Joe Flacco in Cleveland, he has 565 yards passing and 5 passing touchdowns, averaging 19.3 fantasy points per game. That's more than Bryce Young has had in like the last 2 months of the season. Now a matchup going up against Chicago, they allow 16.6 fantasy points per game, right around league average, but this defense has definitely been playing better here as of late. They've forced 11 turnovers over their last 3 games played. We also know that running back Jerome Ford suffered a wrist injury and is questionable to play in this ball game. All of the pass catching weapons are healthy though, and that's a plus for Joe Flacco. How good does Joe Flacco look out? It's crazy. I feel like it's 2017 all over again. The matchup is decent and the Browns are still in the playoff hunt, which is crazy to think about. Plus, they're going to have to throw the ball. Chicago, one of the best run defenses in the NFL. Just don't be surprised when my rankings come out this week. Joe Flacco could be verge top 15. Which will then take us out to Green Bay for the Packers and Bucks. And for Baker Mayfield, he's coming off a game in which he only had 144 yards passing and only completed 48% of his passes, yet finished as the quarterback 12 overall and scored 20 fantasy points. It's all about them TDs, and he had 3 total touchdowns in week 14. What's crazy, though, is he had a bad game from his top receivers. Evans and Godwin, they combined for a total of 6 catches for 61 yards. Now, 5 of Baker's last 8 games have resulted in at least 17 fantasy points per game. In this matchup, though, Green Bay allows only 14.8. That's 7th fewest, but this defense is super Jekyll Hyde. You just never know which defense is going to show up weekly, and last week we went out there and we saw Tommy DeVito score over 17 fantasy points against this defense. Baker Mayfield could easily do the same. Overall, this offense is healthy. Baker Mayfield is healthy. The matchup is better than it seems, and this is a must-win game for Tampa Bay to try to keep the division lead. Baker Mayfield, once again, going to be hovering right around the top 15. How about Jordan Love? Last week for Jordan Love was like the fantasy equivalent of just absolutely crapping the bed. His worst game since week 5. He broke his 4-game streak of at least 250 yards passing and multiple touchdowns. The Packers are just so hard to freaking understand. They can look so good one week and then the next week look like a completely different team. It's like they're really trying to overcomplicate things at times and it makes no sense. Now a matchup against Tampa Bay. Perfect opportunity to get things right once again in Green Bay. Do you remember how we talked about Desmond Ridder in this matchup last week? Yeah, that's what we get from Jordan Love here this week. As of right now, Tampa allows over 19 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That's 5th most in the league. But we got some injuries in Green Bay. Aaron Jones basically been perma-injured here all year. Christian Watson, we know he's dealing with a hamstring injury. And then Dontavian Wicks is also questionable to play here this week with a high ankle sprain. Now, on the other side of that, the good news is that Jordan Love himself is healthy, and he still has other healthy weapons like Romeo Doubs and Jaden Reed to get the job done and put up a decent fantasy game. This matchup is just too great to ignore, honestly, and with the weapons he still has, Jordan Love going to be right around verge top 12 for me here this week. which then takes us out to Miami for the Dolphins and the Jets. And for Zach Wilson, it's amazing if you just let a player play to his strengths, how much better he can be than trying to make him something he's not. What we just saw from Zach Wilson last week absolutely proves that. 301 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions against the Houston Texans. By far his best game of the season, and you can tell that he was able to play without having to overthink things too much. It's really similar to the story that we always seem to bring up around Justin Fields. Don't turn these guys who are instinctual quarterbacks into pocket passers. It's just not going to work. Now he gets a matchup going up against Miami. They allow 17.3 fantasy points per game, 13th most in the league, but Zach Wilson didn't get a chance to play against this team just a couple weeks ago. Now overall, the offense is fairly healthy, but something to pay attention to is it's come out here that Zach Wilson himself is dealing with a minor knee injury. Now, it doesn't sound like it's anything that's going to keep him out of the ball game, but definitely something to pay attention to. What's crazy about this to me, though, is does it make any sense that the Buffalo Bills only have 2 wins more than the New York Jets right now? That is absolutely nuts. Now, my rankings come out here towards the end of the week. Zach Wilson's probably still going to be hanging out right around quarterback 18 to 24, just due to the inconsistencies we've seen in his play. I really want to believe that they're just going to let Zach Wilson go out there and let it fly, but in the first round of the fantasy playoffs for so many people, probably not going to be a guy that's going to be too highly ranked anywhere. But on the other side of the football, what was once a locked-in weekly must-start quarterback, we're starting to see some struggles for Tua, and we got to keep it real. If Tyreek Hill isn't healthy and playing, this Dolphins offense looks completely different. Somehow Tyreek Hill suffered a high ankle sprain in week 14, missed a chunk of the game, but came back and played and basically look like the same damn player. That is not normal. But now we've seen Tua struggle in 2 of his last 3 games played. One of those games was against this Jets team just 3 weeks ago, where he only had 243 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions. The Jets allow only 13.4 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That is second fewest in the NFL. We know that Tyreek Hill is going to be questionable probably the entire week, but most importantly, 3 members of the offensive line are questionable to play as of right now as well. Tua is healthy himself, but he just got sacked 5 times in week 14. That's the most he's been sacked in any game this season, and we know the last thing we want is Tua taking big hits. Then you add this matchup on top of it. The only positive I can really find is this is a home game for Tua, and typically they play better at home. Tua, though, for me this week's probably going to be a Verge top 12 option. We'll then take us down to New Orleans for the Saints and the New York Giants, and let's kick it off with Tommy DeVito. If you're not doing this while watching the video, what are you even doing with your life right now? But hey, let's talk about Tommy DeVito, because honestly, is this kid better than Daniel Jones? I mean, he's won 3 straight games here, and last week he had a season high at 71 yards rushing. Now, sure, we've seen some bigger games from Daniel Jones in the past, but with the amount of money that they're paying Daniel Jones, is it that big of an upgrade over Tommy DeVito? Because I really don't think so at this point. He's really protecting the football as well. No interceptions over the last 3 weeks. Really the only issue when it comes to fantasy football and Tommy DeVito is touchdowns. Can he get enough of them weekly to be startable? If he can't, we really need huge rushing upside days like we just had in week 14, because this is an offense that doesn't throw the ball very much. Tommy DeVito doesn't have a game yet this season in which he's had at least 30 pass attempts, a very low volume passing offense. Now a matchup going up against New Orleans. They allow only 15.2 fantasy points per game. That's 10th fewest in the NFL. Overall, though, this offense in New York fairly healthy. DeVito himself is healthy. This matchup, though, it's not great. And it's never easy to travel on the road and play in New Orleans. Now, I'm going to go ahead and keep this kid ranked inside my top 24, but in such a low volume passing offense, I have a hard time ranking him any higher. Now, somebody I don't mind ranking low at all would be Derek Carr there on the opposite side of the football. He hasn't finished inside the top 19 quarterbacks now since week 9. He had 2 passing touchdowns last week, which was great, but only 119 yards passing and finished as the quarterback 21 overall. It's clear he's not 100% healthy, and honestly, at this point, I feel like they continue to go with Derek Carr because they don't want to start Jameis Winston, have Jameis play better, and then they look like fools for going out and paying and bringing in Derek Carr when they already had Jameis Winston. But now they're going to match up going up against the Giants. They allow 15.6 fantasy points per game. That is 11th fewest in the NFL. And we really saw this defense play well against Jordan Love and the Packers last week. Plus, we got some injuries on offense. Rashid Shaheed, Taysom Hill, they're both still questionable to play. Plus, Derek Carr himself continues to play through shoulder injuries. Given all the injuries and this matchup, Carr is on the verge of not even being inside my top 24. Which will then bring us out to Tennessee for the Titans and the Houston Texans. And for CJ Stroud, I would love to sit here and make eye contact with you and just tell you how confident I am that CJ Stroud is going to remain a top-tier quarterback option for the rest of the season. I can't say that, though. As of right now, he's still in the concussion protocol, and we do not know whether or not he's going to clear in time to play. We also know a couple weeks ago he lost Tank Dell, and then last week Nico Collins also went down with a calf injury. On top of that, Noah Brown still does not look fully healthy, and Dalton Schultz is currently questionable. Then they get a matchup going up against Tennessee, who allows 15.8 fantasy points per game. Right around average, but they played great against the Dolphins offense in week 14, and they're starting to play with a lot more confidence. Now, obviously, we need to see if CJ Stroud clears concussion protocol and if Nico Collins is healthy enough to play. But until we know that, CJ Stroud is going to be outside my top 15 quarterbacks, which sounds crazy to say. Now, maybe you're sitting there saying, well, what happens if he clears the protocol and Nico plays? Great question. If that's the case, verge top 12 at best. But what about in Tennessee? Another rookie quarterback in Will Levis, and while it wasn't his best fantasy day of his career so far, maybe his best overall NFL game of his career. He had 327 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, 16 yards rushing, and led a late game comeback win over the Miami Dolphins. That is absolutely huge, especially since it was on the road. But let's not just sit back and ignore the fact that Miami's defense saw the team get a 2-score lead and basically got lazy. The Miami defense was giving up yards in chunks at the end of the game. I really couldn't tell if the defense was that bad or if Will Levis was playing that good. That last drive of the game was check down after check down after check down, and they could not stop it. Now they get a matchup going up against Houston. They allow 18.7 fantasy points per game. That is 8th most in the NFL. Overall, this offense is fairly healthy, just not a lot of top-tier options after DeAndre Hopkins. We also know that Will Levis, now he's starting to play with a little bit more confidence. Now, the matchup isn't overly bad. We can give him that, but the ceiling for Will Levis just isn't consistent. This is one of the lower scoring offenses in the NFL, and I really view Will Levis as more of a low-end quarterback too, someone who's going to hover right around the top 20 quarterbacks each and every week. Which then takes us out to New England for the Patriots and the Chiefs, and for Patrick Mahomes, we've entered an era where he doesn't score as many fantasy points as everyone wants. In fact, he scored under 16 fantasy points now in 4 of the last 6 games he's played. I can remember earlier in the season during one of our Mac and the Medic segments where Matt came out and said, listen, Patrick Mahomes, he's just not fantasy elite this year. He got so much hate in the comment section. People saying that they have to unsubscribe due to such stupidity. And here we are. So many people got butthurt, but you know what? I haven't heard from those people in quite some time. Weird how that works out. We're just so used to Mahomes going out and getting over 300 yards passing and multiple touchdowns each and every week that when he plays like an average NFL quarterback, it just looks worse than it really is. He's in fact only finished inside the top 12 at the position 1 time over the last month. Now a matchup going up against New England. They allow 14.6 fantasy points per game, 6th fewest in the league. We know Isaiah Pacheco, he's dealing with a shoulder injury, but this Chiefs offense overall is just mid-AF. There are no alpha wide receivers, and Travis Kelce is suffering because opposing defenses can just focus in on him because they don't have to worry about any of the other pass catching options. Sure, there's some solid options in the offense, but none of them are true alphas that can take over a game. Because of that, Mahomes is having to do even more and more each week himself, just trying to will the Chiefs to victory. And if they don't get a victory, he gets pissed off. Now, obviously, with the way he reacted after the loss last week to Buffalo, a lot of people have hopped on the Mahomes hater bandwagon. And that bandwagon is always going to be full when you're not playing the best. Then you take all those offensive woes and you add in the fact there's a road game in Foxborough against a tough defense. Patrick Mahomes still going to be in the quarterback 1 top 12 territory, but a lot closer to 12 than he is to 1. Then for New England, we got Bailey Zappi, and for him, it was a tale of 2 halves in week 14. He went out in the first half and carved up the Pittsburgh Steelers, having 3 touchdowns. Second half came and didn't do much of anything. In fact, the second half looked like we thought the entire game would look coming into that game. Now, was it the great play of Zappe that led to all those touchdowns? Or was it the Pittsburgh defense just taking him too lightly? Because like I said, once the second half started, Bailey Zappe couldn't do anything. To me, that first half really looks like more of an outlier than the new normal. Now a matchup going up against Kansas City. They allow 15.7 fantasy points per game, right around league average, but so many injuries in New England. We know about Ramondre Stevenson. Then we have Devontae Parker and Demario Douglas, both questionable to play in this game as well. Given all the injuries in a somewhat difficult matchup, I'm not going to consider Bailey Zappe here in Week 15. Which will then bring us out to Arizona, a matchup of the Cardinals and the 49ers. And for Brock Purdy, let's just keep this simple, stupid like we have for weeks. I can sit here and share all kinds of stats and numbers and reasons as to why you should start Brock Purdy each and every week, but I think everyone is seeing it at this point, right? Dude is actually in the MVP talks for this season. All of his weapons are healthy. Arizona allows over 18 fantasy points per game, 10th most in the NFL. He's scored over 20 fantasy points in 5 of his last 6 games played, and he's a locked and loaded top 12 play each and every week. So what about on the other side of the field, Kyler Murray? Now he's coming off the bye week and he's playing at home, which is great. But he's playing against San Francisco, which is not great. The silver lining here is more than likely Arizona is going to be trailing, and they're going to have to throw the ball all 4 quarters. Plus, it's easier to throw on San Francisco than it is to run on San Francisco. But you got to think that pass rush is going to be in the backfield quickly. They're going to be all over Kyler Murray, which could lead to a little bit more rushing upside this week as well. But San Francisco allows only 14.3 fantasy points per game, 5th fewest in the league, and rookie wide receiver Michael Wilson and Hollywood Brown are still dealing with injuries and are questionable to play this season. Given the limited amount of weapons and the matchup here, I see Murray as more of a quarterback 12 to 15 this week. Which then takes us over to LA for the Rams and the Washington Commandos. We'll start off with Sam Howell because I'm glad to have him off his bye week. He's the current overall quarterback, 6th in fantasy football, averaging over 19 fantasy points per game. And let's not forget the reason why we love Sam Howell so much is because his defense is absolute hot garbage and he has to throw the ball all game long every single week. He's scored over 18 fantasy points now in 9 of his last 10 games played, with a matchup this week going up against the Rams who allow 18.8 fantasy points per game, 7th most in the NFL. Overall, this offense is healthy, and with Howell being a consistent producer in a decent matchup, another top 12 option for me here in Week 15. What about Matthew Stafford? You gotta believe that Matthew Stafford has to be a top 12 option this week as well. Not just because of the matchup, but with the way that this offense is playing here as of late. Coming into Week 12, Matthew Stafford only had 1 game all year long with multiple touchdown passes. He's now done it in 3 straight games, and his team as a whole has scored over 30 points in 3 straight games. With some difficult matchups mixed in. Games against Cleveland and Baltimore, and they're still putting up points. Now a matchup going up against Washington, it has to be easier. They allow over 22 fantasy points per game, 2nd most in the NFL. Now we know that Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, they've been fighting through injuries, but they've been playing and playing well. We also know that Tyler Higbee and Tutu Atwell questionable to play here this week. Now, with the emergence of rookie tight end Davis Allen, who a lot of people had no idea who he was, but don't tell that to Davis Allen because he thinks he's Travis Kelce. There's plenty of offensive options here in LA to give Matthew Stafford another solid day. He's going to be inside my top 12 this week. Which will then take us out to Buffalo for a matchup of the Dallas Cowboys and Buffalo Bills, my Manscaped matchup of the week. Now, I've been trying to warn you guys for weeks that Christmas is right around the corner. It's already the 2nd week of December, and there are people all over the place scrambling for Christmas gifts. Well, as soon as this video is over, scramble over to manscaped.com. They have everything from deodorant to cologne to shampoo, conditioner, body wash, whatever it may be, there's something for everyone. Why not head over there, knock out a couple Christmas gifts, and get them at a discount? Use the referral code HEADLINERS at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. And it's a couple of must-start options here for us in Week 15. We know we're already starting Dak Prescott and Josh Allen each and every week. The number 1 overall quarterback, the number 3 overall quarterback. Now they're going up against each other, and both teams need to continue winning ball games. Both these guys average over 21 fantasy points per game. Both have top 5 NFL offenses. Both have top 6 overall NFL defenses. All the main offensive threats on both sides of the field are healthy with the exception of Dalton Kincaid, who is currently questionable there for the Buffalo Bills, but these guys have a ceiling that's way too high to ever sit. They're both going to be inside my top 12 here in Week 15. Which now brings us to Sunday Night Football, a matchup of the Baltimore Ravens and Jacksonville Jaguars. And for Lamar Jackson, this is exactly the type of matchup we want heading in to the fantasy playoffs. Lamar against that Jacksonville defense? Abso-freaking-lutely we're interested here this week, especially since we've seen ceiling Lamar here 2 of the last 3 weeks. Now, sure, he's lost Mark Andrews, but there's still plenty of other guys in that offense that are stepping up and making big plays. Guys like Odell Beckham Jr., Zay Flowers, and now Isaiah Likely. It's actually kind of weird to have Lamar Jackson this time of year. We haven't been able to capitalize off a fantasy playoff Lamar in years. He's been hurt, but now a matchup going up against Jacksonville, they allow over 20 fantasy points per game, 3rd most in the NFL. Now, like we mentioned, we don't have Mark Andrews, but the rest of this offense is healthy. Lamar himself is healthy. This matchup almost as good as it gets, and the Ravens need to keep winning. They're trying to lock up that #1 overall seed in the AFC. Lamar going to be a top 5 option for me in week 15. But what about for Trevor Lawrence? That injury he suffered in week 13. So many people thought it could be season ending. It looked painful. He looked like he was done. Never would have known that in week 14. He went out and threw the ball a season-high 50 times, had a season-high 3 touchdown passes, and a season-high 3 interceptions as well, and came up just short against the Cleveland Browns. This is now 4 straight games, though, for Trevor Lawrence, where he scored at least 20 fantasy points, and the fact that he did it last week against Cleveland kind of gives us a little bit of hope this week against Baltimore. What's crazy, though, is Trevor Lawrence and Lamar Jackson have both finished top 12 at the quarterback position 7 out of the 13 weeks this season. But now back to this matchup against Baltimore. They allow 13.6 fantasy points per game. That's 3rd fewest in the NFL. But last week, Matthew Stafford hung 23.7 fantasy points on them. We all know that Christian Kirk is not going to be available, but still plenty of high-quality targets in Calvin Ridley, Evan Ingram, and Zay Jones. All 3 of those guys had over 12 targets last week. It looks like Trev's going to be able to play through this ankle injury, which is great. This matchup, though, is not great, and that's probably what's going to keep him just outside the top 12. Which then leads us to the last game of the week, Monday Night Football, the Philadelphia Eagles and Seattle Seahawks for Jalen Hurts. We already know we start him every single week without question. Now, sure, last week kind of sucked, but that was the first game since week 2 that he didn't score at least 19.9 fantasy points. Give credit to the Dallas defense, because it was only the 2nd game all year that Jalen Hurts failed to record a passing touchdown. It was also his first game since Halloween without a rushing touchdown. But look at the schedule he's faced here as of late. Dallas twice, San Francisco, Buffalo, Kansas City. Now they get a matchup going up against Seattle, which is infinitely better for Philadelphia, because Seattle allows 17.8 fantasy points per game, 12th most in the league, and all the weapons in Philadelphia are currently healthy. Plus, Jalen Hurts himself seems to be closer to 100% than he has been at any time over the last 4 to 6 weeks. This matchup is great, and he's the #2 overall quarterback in fantasy football. I think we're going to continue to start him, but what about for Seattle? Is it going to be Geno Smith? Is it going to be Drew Lock? Am I the only one out there that thinks that maybe Drew Lock could be the better option here this week? Geno is still currently questionable with his injury, and Drew Lock just went out last week in week 14 and had 269 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions against a very tough San Francisco defense. Seattle needs to keep winning ball games, though. If they want to have any opportunity of sneaking into the playoffs, they need to win every single game here on out. And this just happens to be one of those matchups where who's ever playing quarterback has an opportunity at huge fantasy points. Going up against Philadelphia, they allow over 22 fantasy points per game, most in the NFL. All of the major playmakers in Seattle are healthy, so really all eyes are on Geno Smith. Like I said, it may sound crazy, but I'm kind of hoping it's Drew Lock. I don't want any injury limitations here in a matchup that is this great. Either way, though, these quarterbacks are going to be hovering right around quarterback 15 or so on the week. The reason I want Drew Lock, I just think the ceiling has that potential to be a little bit higher, but for the most part, 2 guys are going to be right there in that QB2 range anyway. All right, that's going to do it for my quarterback start and sit video here. Week 15 fantasy football here in the fantasy playoffs. I'm hoping that a lot of people out there have some great opportunities at walking away with some championship titles. Remember, once you get into the playoffs, anything can happen. Sure, there's a lot of quarterbacks out there right now that maybe we hadn't expected on starting, but all you can do is take the information you're given and make the best possible decisions for your fantasy football team. I have no doubt Headliner Nation about to add so many trophies to the trophy case, but I'm going to go ahead and get out of here today. Hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.